question that I'm frequently asked. Do we really have free will? Do not our genetic background, our genetic makeup, education, brainwashing, societal influences, environment, etc., do not they determine our choices? Do not they determine our decisions? And therefore, we don't really have free will. So there's a few aspects of the response to this question. Number one, there's no evidence, there is evidence of these things influencing the person, but we don't have evidence that these things totally determine the person's decisions. Because you see, you have people from similar backgrounds, similar societies, same genetic makeup, twins, etc. And nevertheless, they could make different decisions in different situations, and they could go totally against the norm, the prototype for that particular society, that particular educational system, that particular ghetto, that particular neighborhood, etc. And so, inasmuch as we have no way of predicting that a person in this situation, this in society, this in this DNA will do this and this, all we can say is there's a greater likelihood. So that's not a removal of free will, that is an influence on it. And indeed, the Talmud Jewish sources point this out, that a person could be born with a propensity, a tendency towards being a shedder of blood. He's bloodthirsty. So you'd say it, you'd look at that and say, oh my God, that's terrible. That means he's condemned to be evil. And the Talmud says, no, he's not. Even if he has that tendency, so on the good side, he could be a surgeon, he could do circumcisions, be a mohel, he could be a butcher, a chef, etc. He could be a pathologist, he could, etc. And that would be all fine, because he's utilizing his lack of feelings about blood, his callousness, if you like to put it that way, no offence to any surgeons, butchers, etc. But he's using that for something positive. On the other side of the scale, he could be a murderer. He could mug people. He could be a professional fighter. He could be a whole bunch of negative things. I've got to be careful here. I don't want to offend any professional fighters. I'm just using this as an example. Don't take it personally, please. But in any case, she is using the influence of genetics, of environment, etc. But that doesn't take away my free will. That just puts the free will in a particular area of life. Indeed, Rabbi Dessler puts it this way. He says, every person has free will, but no two people have the same free will. You see, your genetics, your background, your education determines what the point in which your free will is struggling. Where is that point in which your free will is struggling? If you are brought up in a gang in Newark somewhere, right, then what you're struggling with is going to be probably things like murder and theft. If you are brought up in a nice family, in a nice neighborhood, in another place, you might be struggling with other stuff, drugs, right? In another place, you might be brought up in another family. You know what your struggle might be? Oh, what shall I study this summer, right? I've got all this spare time on my hands, right? Or what charity work shall I do? Or you might be brought up in another situation and your struggle is, how shall I distribute my charity? Give a lot to one group, give a little bit to small groups. You have free will. All of these people have free will. One guy's free will is trying to figure out which murder weapon he should use. The nunchucks, the knife, the knuckle duster, or the gun, right? Another person's free will is, how shall I distribute my charity money? Those are radically different and very, very far apart. And yes, so the environment, their upbringing had an enormous influence, but it doesn't eliminate their free will, because they still have that moral struggle. And each one in his particular area is struggling just as hard as the other person. So whether I'm struggling, and obviously in education, I want to bring up my children so they're not struggling with sins like murder, theft, etc. What they're struggling is, they're struggling with a free will decision about how best to say thank you to someone, right? How best to distribute my charity. Those are great decisions, but they're also free will. So free will has a sliding scale of free will, if you'd like to look at it that way. There's different areas in which we're battling. Rav Dessler compares it to like trench warfare in the First World War. You know, where was the battle taking place? The battle was taking place in the two trenches in the middle of Belgium. He's back in London, not much of a battle aside from the occasional Zeppelin lopping some bombs at you, right? Back in Berlin, not much of a struggle either, aside from a little bit of starvation. But basically, the war takes place in the trenches in Belgium, moving back and forth, back and forth. In our life, it also works like that. There are certain areas which are conquered territory. I don't have a struggle with murder. Well, generally not, unless someone's really slow in the fast lane. But I don't struggle with that idea, right? Outright theft, don't struggle with it. You know, on the other end of the scale, there are things which are way above me, which I don't even think of because they're so way above my level that I don't even think of them. But in the middle there, between the two extremes, that's where my trenches are. That's where I'm struggling. That's where our free will is. Of course, our goal is to keep moving that point of free will, those trenches, further and further and further, more and more conquered territory, so that my free will struggle is no longer between good and evil, or the lesser of two evils. My free will struggle is between good and better than. Rav Nachman of Breslov put it this way. He says, the purpose of giving us free will is so we can eliminate our free will. One possibility of what he means there is we need to move our point of free will up to the level where it's almost as if we don't have free will, because we're just in the sphere of goodness, good and better than, as opposed to good and evil, as opposed to lesser of two evils. Thanks very much for listening, watching, etc.